I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast where we do deep dive interviews each week with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers, and we include your questions and comments. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics and issues distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence, and we invite you to become members of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, we have the privilege and pleasure of talking with journalist, author, and entrepreneur Steven Brill, co-founder and co-CEO of NewsGuard, which tracks online information and rates the reliability of news and information websites. He's also the founder of The American Lawyer, Brill's Content Magazine, Court TV, the Clear Register Traveler Program, and the Yale Journalism Initiative, and his books include Teamsters, America's Bitter Pill, Tailspin, and The Death of Truth, How Social Media and the Internet, and let me give you this whole subtitle. This is his newest book, How Social Media and the Internet Gave Snake Oil Salesmen and Demagogues the Weapons They Needed to Destroy Trust and Polarize the World, and What We Can Do About It. He's a graduate of Yale and Yale Law School, and Steven Brill joins us. I'm glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, first, let me congratulate you on a book which I feel is a very important book. As I said to you earlier when we were just getting acquainted, has some pretty impressive blurbs, Bob Woodward, Timothy Snyder, Floyd Abrams, Jill Abramson. And it's really a book that gives us an encapsulated and very compelling view of the plague of misinformation that we are unfortunately heir to now. And this has all been an evisceration of truth. He makes the case, and he makes it compellingly. Kind of boils down, let me get to the nub of this, of facts not being what they were, or simply not having the clout or the availability that they once had. What's available now is this idea of Kellyanne Conway's, that we have alternative facts or opinions mainly, or conspiracies, hoaxes.
Well, that's right. Everything is an opinion. You have an opinion about who got the most votes in 2020. You have an opinion about whether the COVID vaccine is the reason Colin Powell died, which it's not. You have an opinion about the weather. Is it warmer or colder on Earth today? And what I try to do in this book is explain how we got to a place where too many people just don't believe in a shared set of facts. And it's a shared set of facts that really hold a society together, hold a democracy together. It's one thing to debate trade policy, but if you're debating trade policy without agreeing to the same core set of facts, you really can't do it. In one sense, I'm really regretting being on this podcast, and that's because the title of this podcast is Gray Matter. The introduction you read, said accurately, as best I can tell, that you deal with serious subjects in a serious way by talking to smart people and having a smart audience. So I doubt that there are that many people who are listening today who believe, as 51% of Americans who refuse to take the COVID vaccine believe, that the COVID vaccine has a microchip implanted in it by Bill Gates. I doubt that there are too many people who are listening today who actually believe that the election was stolen in 2020, or that Hank Aaron died from a COVID vaccine, or that
Matthew Perry as well, as you point out.
Oh, yeah, name a celebrity and they've died from COVID vaccines, and a large percent of the world believes that. A large percent of the world, not this audience, but a large percent of the world believes that the U.S. has given hundreds of millions of dollars to Vladimir Zelensky, not to defend Ukraine from a Russian invasion, but so that Vladimir Zelensky, are you ready for this, could buy King Charles's Highgrove estate and buy 2 different, luxury yachts. People out there believe this stuff. And the cause of that, as I explain in the book, there are multiple causes, but the 2 leading causes are 2 technology innovations. One of them are the social media platforms, where the good news is anybody in the world can be a publisher and reach everybody else in the world. And the bad news is that anybody in the world can be a publisher and reach anybody else in the world. So those can be Russian disinformation agents. They could be conspiracy theorists. They could be nuts. They could just, they could be political demagogues. So we've gotten to a point where nobody trusts anything. Well, not nobody, but a large percentage of people, again, not likely the people listening to this podcast, don't trust anything, don't trust anyone.
Well, you mentioned Russian disinformation agents. We should mention that you actually had a personal problem with one of those agents of disinformation who has, about 127 disinformation websites that essentially serve Russian interests and Russian propaganda. He sent a drone to take pictures of your house, and you came under threat. Your whole family came under threat because of this guy?
That's correct. NewsGuard has done reports on him, and in one situation, we did a report. He's a fugitive from justice in Florida who about 10 years ago, his name is John Dugan. About 10 years ago, he fled to Moscow and was granted asylum, apparently because he's got a set of very special skills. He's a highly skilled disinformation operative. In fact, he fled Florida because he was charged with computer hacking and extortion as a result of the hacking. So in Moscow, he operates out of a studio. And one of the, quote, documentaries, unquote, that he produced was one that detailed the scoop that the U.S. was operating a secret bioweapons lab in Ukraine. And that became one of the excuses the Russians used for why they had to invade Ukraine, because they had to wipe out this bioweapons lab that was threatening the Russian people. So we did a report about that documentary, and YouTube took it down. They should have taken it down before we did a report, but they took it down, and that really got him angry, and he launched a campaign against NewsGuard and against me personally and against my family.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that you had to go through that, but you're living dangerously these days and exposing some of what's going on. These people they have interests. In fact, what about the argument some might say, since you have NewsGuard, you're kind of helping your own enterprises here, or your own pocketbook here?
Well, sure I am. No, I have a business that is unabashedly a business. It's a for-profit business. Like other businesses I've started, including the American Lawyer and Court TV and Clear, it's meant to fill a gap and fill a need, and it's proud to be doing that. But I take several occasions in the book to explain that I do have a vested interest in describing the kind of tools NewsGuard has developed, not developed exclusively, and doesn't have monopoly on this, but to help people understand and have information about the reliability of who's feeding them the news. The analogy I use is, and this is why we started NewsGuard. Right now, if you walk into a library, you can see, thousands of books neatly arranged by subject matter. You can pick up the book and read the book jacket. You know who the author is. You know who the author's credentials are. You know who the publisher is. And best of all, there's a librarian there. And the librarian could say, well, this author is a Nobel laureate, but he's kind of on the liberal side. So if you're reading him for economic policy, you may want to read this other author who's also a Nobel laureate, and he's on the conservative side. Now imagine instead if you walked into a library and there were just 1 trillion pieces of paper flying around in the air. And you pluck one out of the air, you don't know who wrote it, you don't know what their credentials are, you don't know who's financing it, you don't know anything. That's the internet. That's your Facebook feed, that's your Twitter feed, that's your Google search. And what we have attempted to do with NewsGuard by rating and then providing point scores for all the websites in the places where we operate, responsible for 95% plus of online engagement, is to give people some sense of who's feeding them the news. Not to censor anything, not to block anything, but to provide in a transparent way what the background is and the credentials are, and if relevant, the agenda is of all the stuff they're reading. And that doesn't mean it has a liberal slant or a conservative slant. I mean, highly conservative news sites get high ratings from NewsGuard because they disclose a conservative agenda.
Yeah, you've said Fox is more reliable than MSNBC, which may be a heresy to those on the left, but you've backed that
The
up.
Fox website is more reliable than the MSNBC news website. That's correct, slightly. We also rate television programs, and Fox doesn't do quite as well.
But there's also the story that came out about the Postmaster General and Donald Trump trying to get things fixed in the last election, which turned out to be a false story. In other words, there are obviously false stories and misinformation come out from both the left and the right, but to a great extent, the assumption has always been more from the right and more from particularly those who are, shall we say, representing interests that are more conservative.
Well, if you probably added up the number of false narratives, we have a catalog of all the false narratives that are out there. They're probably more from the right than the left, but neither side has a monopoly on having the discipline to stick to the facts.
We got actually a question here from Jerry in Aurora, which I think pertains to what we're looking at and thinking about now. He says, you speak of truth and Russian disinformation. Were the 51 security analysts speaking truth when Hunter Biden's laptop was claimed to be a Russian disinformation and all those who offered a counter opinion were banned from the internet?
Well, the premise of the question is incorrect.
Especially the last part of the question, I think, is incorrect.
No one was banned from the internet. I don't even know what that means. And as I recall, the op-ed piece that the national security alumni wrote was they said there is strong evidence that it's a possibility. It was couched in not definitive language. Would I have signed that at that point? Probably not. But where NewsGuard comes in is the only websites that we actually penalized in terms of point scores about the Hunter Biden laptop were the websites like the Daily Beast that just declared that it was, Russian disinformation from the start.
But you could see why some would say, boy, this must be the deep state. You have 51 intelligence officers who have put their signature on this, saying that it was Russian disinformation. Not to say that there isn't a lot of Russian disinformation and bots, because there certainly is, but that disturbed me, I must admit. I thought, where do they get all these signatures?
Well, it disturbed me, but you're overstating what they said. They didn't declare this is Russian. We have investigated, we have found this is Russian disinformation. As I recall, and I don't have the thing in front of me, it said this has all the earmarks of Russian disinformation. Doesn't mean they should have written it, doesn't mean I would have written it, but it's not quite a declaration of fact.
Let's get back to facts, though. They've always been distorted. The difference now is social media, technology, as you said, the internet, and also clickbaits have sort of taken over in the way so many of these things are set up. But in your book, for example, early on, you say nothing new about people being whipped into a frenzy and turning against each other with misinformation or disinformation. You say this early in the first chapter, and you give a bunch of excellent examples. Salem witch trial, Cleopatra smeared by her and Mark Antony's enemies thousands of years ago. And then you get into more recently, American politicians with, Vietnam and weapons in Iraq and all of that. It's always been the case, hasn't it?
It's always been the case, but it hasn't been the case at this level and with this acceleration. So the difference is that social media took something that, as you say, has always been the case and made it incredibly more pervasive and incredibly more persuasive. So let me explain what I mean by that. As you know, the book opens with a chapter, but one of the chapters opens with a young woman who is a techie who's just moved to Silicon Valley named Renee DiResta. And she has a newborn baby. And she goes online because she doesn't have a lot of friends out there who have newborn babies. And she just wants to get basic information about what the vaccine regimen is for a newborn baby. just, the most innocent query you can imagine online. And she's stunned when she sees on Facebook this vehement, vituperative debate going on about whether the measles vaccine is going to kill you. And she can't believe, she doesn't know anyone in her life who thinks that's the case, but she just can't believe that there's this kind of a debate going on. And the more she reads that, the more she discovers the algorithm is sending her other conspiracy theories and other misinformation. And she figures out that that's what the algorithm is intended to do, which is send people the most inflammatory content, because that's what will keep their eyeballs. And that's their business model, is to have people stay on the site as long as possible and therefore see the most ads that they possibly can see. And she ultimately becomes a leading advocate for reform of the technology platforms, runs a group at Stanford now that is heavily engaged in that. So it's really a matter of not just advocates of the olden days who would say something, and if they they might stand on a street corner handing out a leaflet, or if they were Russian disinformation operatives, they might finance some newspaper in Greece or some newspaper somewhere that would publish disinformation. Now the scale of it is so different that it is literally true. I mean, NewsGuard has done all kinds of surveys and studies. We did one where we tracked a bunch of middle schoolers using TikTok and discovered that literally 20% of the searches they did on TikTok produced harmful disinformation and misinformation. If you searched on TikTok for something related to healthcare, if you were a young woman and you searched on TikTok for abortion, you would get videos explaining how you could give yourself an abortion by taking this cocktail of different chemicals easily available in your household. And it turns out that cocktail of chemicals actually could kill you. Also wouldn't cause an abortion. So it's the scale and the pervasiveness that has produced a world in which if demagogues take advantage of that, if conspiracy theorists take advantage of that, as they have, you create a world in which too many people just don't believe in truth, in facts. They don't believe in what I call the referees. The people who I call the referees are the basic people in our society who we sort of count on to operate in good faith and to tell us the truth. They're judges, they're doctors, they're people who work at polling places on election day counting votes. They're people who operate food companies. They're journalists. They're the basic people who hold together a society, because we think most of the time, most of them are operating in good faith. And when you lose that belief that these people are operating in good faith, and you will lose that belief if you go online, you end up with the chaos that we have. One of the people I profile in the book is a guy who, named Dustin Thompson, who worked at a pest control company in Columbus, Ohio, graduate of Ohio State, grew up in a middle-class suburb, perfectly normal, average life. No brushes with the law, not even a speeding ticket. He gets laid off during COVID. He ends up spending a lot of time at home and goes down the internet rabbit hole. And by January 6th, 2021, he's in the Capitol wearing a bulletproof vest and wielding a coat rack as a weapon to use against the police officers there. That's what I'm talking about. He went to sleep on election night thinking that his guy, President Trump, had won the election. He liked President Trump because President Trump was promising to restore the world that he'd grown up in, that, restore the system that had stopped working for him. He went to sleep that night. Trump was ahead, woke up the next morning. Trump had lost. Trump was, claiming all varieties of fraud, as we now know, and he believed it. That, to me, he's emblematic of the unraveling of our civic society, just the way another guy I profile who had COVID. And his doctor tells the story that this guy's on his last dying breath. He has COVID. He's on a ventilator. He's about to die. And just as he's about to die, he takes off the ventilator, says to his doctor, "This COVID thing is total BS." And then he dies. He didn't believe his own lungs. He believed what he'd seen online about Anthony Fauci, getting millions of dollars from the drug companies to promote this phony vaccine.
We used to have a lot more faith in science, though, and that has been so eroded and so, in many ways, I use your word, eviscerated, that you have to wonder what the origins again of this are, in addition to the internet and advertising and
That's
so
what
forth.
I'm saying. The oranges are people don't believe in experts. Experts is actually a bad word. So, for example, one of the other things that Renee DiResta found and that she pointed me to was by 2013, 2014, more people were getting their basic healthcare information online than they were from doctors. And online, the majority of that information was inflammatory, false misinformation. Now, what would compel someone to say or to think, well, I'm going to go online and get this information, not this information from my doctor? One of the things that might compel them to do that, and this goes back to another book I wrote, is that the American healthcare system has failed most people in this country who are in the middle or who are poor. And they think their doctors are trying to rip them off. Their doctors are not trying to rip them off. It's the hospitals and the drug companies, but the healthcare system doesn't work for them. Even if they get to a doctor, they get some complicated explanation. The doctor is now owned by a company. He's not even, self-employed. He knows he has 18 minutes to talk to the patient, get the patient in, get the patient out. So that system has stopped working. And if someone online takes the trouble to explain to you why, I'm not making this up, you should buy a subscription for apricot pits because that will cure your cancer, and your oncologist is just trying to rip you off, a surprising number of people, probably not the people listening to this podcast, are going to believe that.
Well, it's lack of trust, I think, that you've really hit the nail here on. And it's also a sense that somehow all of these are opinions and they don't really stack up necessarily to having the truth outing the way it's supposed to in the cliche, the truth will out. So people are mistrusting experts even more and more. And it's, you have some solutions, and I want to get to those solutions. You have some ways of actually getting us out of this.
Yeah, I'll just add, you may recall in the first 2 pages of the book, I take our readers back to a parents visiting day that my wife and I had when our daughter 30 years ago was in the 4th or 5th grade. And, as parents do, you're standing in the back of the room watching the teacher, in this case, do a math class. And the teacher says to one of the other students, luckily not my daughter, "How much is 6 times 7? And the student says, 41. And the teacher says, "I disagree." And we all sort of rolled our eyes at that, right? How do you disagree with 6 times 7 being 41? It's not 41, it's 42. That's a fact. And the point I make is, well, that was kind of funny and we rolled our eyes. Today, everything is that kind of matter of opinion, whether it's the moon landing or whether Barack Obama was born in the United States or whether the COVID vaccine works or whether Trump had the election stolen from him or whether Trump wasn't allowed to call witnesses at his trial.
There was no Holocaust. That's just an opinion, right? Just another opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here's Ron from Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, says, is part of the problem the secrets held by the government, media, and corporations? Cigarettes were good for us 50 years ago. The Five Eyes was a conspiracy theory 20 years ago. Today, the death toll in Palestine is delivered by Hamas and treated as the truth by major news organizations.
Well,
the media is part of the problem, isn't it, Stephen? I mean,
Call has identified a problem that I actually think a lot of the news organizations, the last example that the caller gave, a lot of the news organizations have gotten better at that, except we don't hear it. And that is, they say, according to Hamas, there are X number of dead people. But part of that also is the problem that you can't do the kind of independent reporting in Gaza that you might like to do, that everybody would like to do. But yeah, I mean, a big issue is not only the secrets held by the government, but the fact that the government has often been wrong. So there's a lot of fuel to create the kind of doubt. But when the doubt sort of washes off on Anthony Fauci, because we said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when there weren't, or because we said we were winning the war in Vietnam when we weren't, if that
because Fauci, has ties to the Wuhan lab,
right,
which can be presented in a way that's...
If that washes over into, sort of a universal view that everybody's lying, everybody is out to get me, then you can believe that the two poll workers in Atlanta are hustlers who are passing around, computer chips that have, voting records on them, as Rudy Giuliani said, like heroin. So once you sort of take people down the escalator of distrust and you create a world where nobody's trusted.
And as you point out, it creates lack of civility and chaos, and there's all kinds of repercussions and consequences.
Because everybody is at everybody's throat. There's a poll that I talk about in the book that The Economist did, which I think is really important. They polled people and asked them to choose one of two answers. The world is, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have it in front of me, but the world is full of mostly good people who want to do mostly good things. And the second is, the world is full of evil people who are threatening me in my way of life. And you had to choose one or the other. The overall choice was about half and half, but the Trump voters chose the latter. The world is full of evil people who are threatening me, something like 82% to 18%.
It makes people more comforted, I think, to think in conspiracies. If there are bands of pedophiles, and pedophilia is a real problem. Lots of people feel that it's increased through the years, and it probably has. If they feel that there's a conspiracy behind it, it gives them a sense of order. It gives them a sense of the opposite of chaos in some ways, doesn't it, psychologically?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It gives them, as you put it, a sense of order, a sense of, well, now I have something to grab onto. This makes sense. This narrative makes sense. It's not just helter-skelter, but there's this narrative. And, there's the QAnon narrative. There's the vaccine hoax narrative. And to have that narrative, you need to pick the enemies, who are the evil people who are promoting the narrative. You need to pick someone or a group of people who are on the other side. And the thing you really have to acknowledge as adding to the mix is that for many people in this country, the system has stopped working for them, and they're looking for something to explain it. And if those narratives give them comfort in explaining it, you start to be able to understand what's going on in the world. So what do I mean by that? Well, most polls recently taken indicate that the typical middle-class American thinks that their children will not grow up to be as prosperous as they are. And that is a total reversal of the whole history of the American dream. And why is that? Well, we did execute, trade agreements that wiped out jobs across, furniture factories in the South and steel factories in the Rust Belt. We did do certain things, create certain things, whether they were overall good or bad, that cost people in the middle a lot of their security and their sense that the country was working for them.
We're talking with Steven Brill, the author of The Death of Truth and many other books. His most recent book is what I wanted to focus on, and I want to focus now on solutions, or at least ways to get us out of this conundrum that we're in. Conundrum is a kind word to describe it, all this misinformation and all that we've been talking about. Before I do, let me go to some of your questions. Zach from West Palm Beach wants to know, what do you think of the current Court TV? This is a bit of a digression, since you were one of the real major forces in bringing Court TV to us.
Well, I haven't watched it much, but to the extent I've watched, I've been disappointed that its focus is typically more on the kind of sleazy, tawdry trials. We had, lots of criminal trials. We had the O.J. Simpson case, but we worked very hard to build audiences and create ratings for things like a war crimes tribunal at The Hague that we did, a very famous medical malpractice case in New York. And I always thought that what Court TV should do would be, should be to shine the light on how the justice system actually works. And the best way to do that is not so much to write about it, but when it comes to trials, to show people what the jury is seeing when the jury is making a decision, which is why I'm really, frustrated and regret that people couldn't see what the jury saw in the recent trial of the former president, because instead what they saw was exactly what Court TV was created to be an antidote to, and that was, in this case, the defendant coming out of court every day, spinning it, telling people what happened in the courtroom, which most of the time was not what happened, or people who are opponents of Trump spinning it in the opposite direction on cable television, and no one really saw what the jury saw, and that would explain the jury's decision. When I started Court TV, the idea really was I had done lots of magazine articles where I was one of the first journalists to interview jurors after high-profile cases. Why did you decide what you decided? And in every situation, even if it wasn't a high-profile case, even if it was just, even if I just picked a typical case just to show how the typical system worked, the jurors always just unanimously came away with one verdict, which was, the system is really, it really works. I was fascinated by it. It really works. People are operating in good faith. The judge is really careful about what evidence that he admits. Everything's vetted. People are sincere. They're trying to do the right thing, and it comes out the right way. It works a lot better than what I see on the 11 o'clock news. And again, if people had seen how the trial operated in the Trump case, I'm certain that would have been the reaction.
I was disappointed they didn't have cameras there as well for so many reasons. But let me go to another question from Reed in Santa Rosa, who says, as journalism evolves, what do you see as the next phase, and how will truth and facts matter? Where are we to turn now? Where do you put your trust? Actually, you say that AI is going to be a great accelerant against making things better, although you give some solutions, and I want to get to those.
Right, I do give some solutions, but for now, it is the great force multiplier. So instead of, a half a dozen or a dozen people sitting in St. Petersburg operating a Russian disinformation machine to post, phony, Facebook accounts and YouTube accounts and Twitter accounts, you could have one or two people posting thousands of posts at a time. targeting people exquisitely, changing the language to reach people of a certain age or a certain nationality. The ability of generative AI as a force multiplier is just, it's hard even to gauge. Second, the ability of generative AI as something that, puts almost the final nail in the coffin of trust is hard to gauge. So to give you sort of the converse example, remember the Access Hollywood tape from 2016, right? If that happened today, Trump could easily say, well, that's a deep fake. I didn't do that. That's not me. That's not my voice. And a lot of us wouldn't be sure he's not telling the truth because there's so many deep fakes out there. There's so much stuff. It's so easy to fake that. So generative AI presents a real threat beyond the threat that journalists have written about, which is, well, you could train generative AI to do my job. Well, I don't really agree with that when it comes to real journalism, because real journalism is you going out there and talking to people and creating new information, not simply regurgitating stuff that's already been posted online, which is what large language models do. So, the next story I write, if I interview 6 people, you're not going to be able to have generative AI interview those 6 people, at least not the way I would interview them. So I think it's less of a threat to real journalism. The big threat is it undermines real journalism by creating what looks like real journalism. NewsGuard did a report a couple of weeks ago where one of our analysts just went online and found this guy online in Pakistan who has a service. And for $104, he created for our analysts a fake generative AI powered newspaper purporting to be a newspaper covering politics in Ohio. And he went and stole all these stories that were online from all these other places and put a little spin on them, and all done with generative AI, $104 to create this machine that just kept going. The second or third day, he told the machine, you know what, start doing stories that favor Sherrod Brown, who's running for the Senate, for re-election in the Senate in Ohio, that favor Sherrod Brown and disfavor his opponent. And you started seeing stories in this thing that looks like an Ohio newspaper, the Ohio Eagle or something, that said that, Sherrod Brown supports the Little League, and Sherrod Brown has long been a supporter of nutrition programs, just all this great Sherrod Brown stuff. And then all this negative stuff about his opponent. So 2 days later, he told the machine to switch sides. And suddenly his opponent was a longtime supporter of aid for blood transfusions, for the Little League, for, feeding the homeless. And Sherrod Brown had been involved in all these scandals, all made up, all looking real. $104.
Well, I was thinking about what you write about with the Santa Monica Observer that made stuff out of whole cloth, including the debate that Hillary Clinton was in with former President Trump, and saying that she had died and they sent a double to. I mean, the stuff comes out of a fictional imagination.
Well, that brings up, though, a very important point that we haven't talked about yet. I've talked about social media platforms as one of the tech developments that has created this world of chaos and polarization. The other is something that few of your listeners probably are as aware of as they should be, and that is programmatic advertising. Today, most ads, which finances most content, most journalism, most ads, 80%, are done by machine, but are placed by machine, or placed by an algorithmic auction. And it's meant to follow you, your demographic, wherever you go online. It doesn't care where you are online. So to give you one example, and then I'll come back to the Santa Monica Observer, a couple of years ago, we discovered that the largest single financial supporter of Sputnik, the Russian propaganda site, was Warren Buffett. Now, it's not like Warren Buffett wakes up every morning and says, how do I send more money to Vladimir Putin? It's that Warren Buffett owns Geico, the insurance company, and Geico does, zillions of dollars a year worth of programmatic advertising, some of which ends up on Sputnik, some of which ends up on Stop the Steal sites or phony healthcare sites, you name it. So let's go back to the Santa Monica Observer. Santa Monica Observer, you remember the night that Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul, was attacked in their home.
Yeah, they said it was a love meeting that Paul Pelosi had with some pedophilia made up out of whole cloth.
So the Santa Monica Observer, which we had identified a couple of years before as this hoax website posing as a local news site. And we, among the other stories, as you mentioned, they had run was the one that Hillary Clinton had died in 2015, and a body double had participated in the debate with Donald Trump in 2016. So the Santa Monica Observer runs this story that Paul Pelosi was in an encounter with a gay prostitute. Elon Musk retweets it. Don Jr. retweets it. It goes viral. Now, what does that mean for the Santa Monica Observer? Well, by having put the headline in the first sentence of that story on its Twitter account where it could be retweeted, it's that everybody who saw the retweets went to the article. They clicked on and went to the article of the Santa Monica Observer. What does that mean? That means that suddenly hundreds of thousands of people were looking at the Santa Monica Observer. As a result, they got hundreds of thousands of dollars in programmatic advertising. For example, a Hertz ad appeared right under the story about Paul Pelosi. There's no way Hertz wanted to be under that story, associated with that story.
And programmatic advertising is responsible for, and you point out especially the role of Silicon Valley in this, for a tremendous sense of
billions of dollars.
Stories being communicated, to large numbers of people, huge numbers of people, just on the basis of profit. It's avarice that's behind all that. And
so they're financing this stuff. What people don't understand is, especially stories like that in a place like the Santa Monica Observer, they're in it for the money. And the way they get the money is through programmatic advertising. And one of the self-serving points I make in the book is that there are things you can do, including using the filters that NewsGuard has developed so that you can distinguish between the Santa Monica Observer and the San Francisco Chronicle, which actually pays reporters to write the story of what actually happened to Paul Pelosi.
I want to get into solutions with you, Steven, but I want to we've got a couple more questions if we can answer them and then move on to solutions, because I would feel remiss if we didn't. This is Teresa from Cincinnati, who says, how do you balance the need for deep investigative reporting with the fast-paced nature of modern news cycles?
I think you have to do both. And most good investigative reporting, I should tell the listener that I teach a seminar in journalism at Yale, and one of the things I tell my students is that investigative reporting is a redundant concept. Reporting should be investigative. Everything should be looked at with skepticism and so you get to the real story. But I think you have to, if you're running a journalism business, you have to stay up with the current news, but pivot off of stories that are in the current news into, quote, investigative stories about those issues and stories that are in the current news. And I think you can do the balance. The New York Times, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the Philadelphia Inquirer have made their way doing a good mix of both.
And here's Jeff from Miami Beach, who says, how do you mitigate perhaps even unintentional bias from NewsGuard's own staff and or algorithms?
Well, the way we do it is with a ridiculous, obsessive transparency. So when we publish a rating, it's the way the site scores on the basis of 9 apolitical journalistic criteria. And with that rating, if you click on it, you get a 3,000 or 4,000 word nutrition label that explains how we applied the rating, links to the bios of the 3 or 4 people who worked on that rating, so you can see whatever biases they have, that we always call the site for comment first and include their comments if we're going to say anything negative. We always publish complaints. And unlike, we're not the only ones who do ratings. We're just the only ones who do transparent ratings. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Google all have algorithms that supposedly rate news sites, but you and I have no idea how they rate them, but they do rate them. And if you were the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle or even the Santa Monica Observer and you wanted to know what your rating was, you wouldn't know whom to call or what to ask, and they wouldn't tell you if you got them on the phone, because they'd say, well, we rate them by algorithm, and if you knew how we did it, you'd game our algorithm. We want people to game our system. We want them to look at our 9 criteria and say, well, gee, if I had a corrections policy, which is one of our criteria, I'd get a higher rating from NewsGuard. Well, hallelujah, that's great. And some 3,000 websites have done something to improve their score, but it's a group effort. We check ourselves on bias all the time. That doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, but our record so far is that you'd be hard pressed. We've been complained about and accused of all kinds of things from some websites on the left and some websites on the right.
What do you think of Snopes' record?
I think Snopes is liberally biased and sloppy in its fact checking.
Well, then let's talk about solutions. I mean, you've laid out the problem, as I said, in a very compelling way, in a very detailed way. Let's talk about, first of all, charging for content and Section 230. These are things that you bring to the fore here, and maybe also terms of service. I mean, that's a kind of triad that we can start with, right, in terms of looking ways out of this morass that we're in. Yeah.
Well, Section 230, which was passed in 1996 to protect CompuServe, AOL, and Prodigy, the 3 legacy old dial-up online services where you had to pay to be on them, and you could join a little chat group. And the Section 230 was passed in 1996. It was 3 paragraphs of a multi-100-page telecommunications reform bill, passed as an afterthought. You can't find a newspaper article about Section 230 until 2 or 3 years after it was passed. And it was done really because those platforms, some of them screened their content, some of them didn't. And the ones that screened their content were sued by people who claimed they were defamed in one of those chat rooms. And the court said, well, since you're screening your content, you're responsible for it. So yes, you can be liable. But the ones that said, we don't screen our content at all, the court said, well, then you're not liable. Well, that didn't quite make sense. Why would you, penalize the good guys who try to do something? So what Section 230 did was it said you're immune from liability for screening your content that appears online. Again, years before you had billions of postings a day from the social media platforms. And so at age 11, Mark Zuckerberg became a Good Samaritan. This Section 230 was called the Good Samaritan Act to protect Good Samaritans. Didn't quite work out that way. The result is that the social media platforms are now the only business you can think of that is completely immune from any liability related to the safety of the product it produces in the marketplace. You can't think of any other business that has that immunity. So, for example, Fox News got sued, as it should have been, for what it said about Dominion voting systems, in the Stop the Steal battles. And the social media platforms said everything that Fox said. The difference is Fox was a cable channel, not a social media platform. So one thing you could do, though, you don't have to even mess with Section 230, because as I explain in the book, there's a much more practical way to do this than to depend on Congress. Congress, as we know, can't even name a post office, let alone do substantive legislation. Right now, any of our listeners can go to their social media platform and look at the terms of service. And the terms of service say, We do not tolerate harmful misinformation or disinformation. We don't tolerate bullying or hate speech. It's basically a list of all the things that they do tolerate. And their excuse always is, well, we know we have to do better. We're sorry. We're trying hard. But their excuse always is, well, if, I'm YouTube and, 2,000 videos are being posted every second, how can I screen it all? That's their excuse. And the world accepts that excuse. And I don't know why the world accepts that excuse. If you walk into a restaurant or a movie theater, there's a sign on the wall that says occupancy by more than X number of people is dangerous and unlawful. That's a fire safety regulation. It doesn't impinge on your right of free assembly or your right to see the movie. It's a safety regulation. You could easily take those terms of service and sue. The FTC could sue based on them, because the argument would be, you're allowing so much content to be posted with so little screening that you're violating your promises in your terms of service, and those promises are a contract. So you either have to limit the number of posts to the number you can actually screen and be responsible for, or cut your profit margins by hiring more people to screen it. But if those are your terms of service, you have to live by them.
But where's the enforcement?
The FTC has has successfully sued Facebook, for example, for billions of dollars for violating its privacy promises in the exact same terms of service.
It's a wonderful example of enforcement, but they're pretty small in number, aren't they still?
Who?
I mean, I think that's your point. Terms of service have not been exactly...
No, it just dawned on me as I was doing this that it's a solution staring everybody in the face. And I consulted all kinds of lawyers, First Amendment lawyers, others lawyers, that kept saying, why can't they do this? Why isn't this a basic contract violation? Everybody's saying, well, come to think of it, you're right.
Well, it's like you say, why can't they ending anonymity online? The same thing.
Well, that's another thing you could do that, again, is content neutral. It's not the government putting its finger on the scale for one kind of content versus another, but it's basically saying you can't post anonymously, because there are benefits to posting anonymously. You don't get embarrassed. You won't get in trouble at your job. It enables free expression. But the downside of having, thousands of Russian bots with Facebook accounts, or having, people who work for a political action committee, posting stuff and standing up websites in favor of one side of the aisle versus another, has created the chaos that we're all living through.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to sound skeptical here. I just wonder how you get through these kind of attitudes that say, "Oh, there are too many." You said it before. I think you said it correctly. There are too many things that have to be checked here. We can't do it. It's not like how many people are assembled or in a restaurant.
But there's no context in which we allow that attitude. What if Elon Musk's car company said, we just can't take the trouble to bother with these seat belts and airbags, let alone fixing the software that's causing, our Teslas, to run off the highway. We just can't be bothered with that. It'll cut into our profit margins. Too many people want our car. No one would say, oh, okay, that's a good point. And yet the other consumer product he operates, Twitter, X, that's exactly what he says. So the attitude, well, that'll cut into their business. Every business has lower profits because they're regulated in some way. What if, Bayer Aspirin said, well, checking our aspirins takes up a lot of time. We have to hire a lot of people. So we're going to sell you an aspirin bottle, of 100 aspirins, and 20 of those aspirins are going to be dangerous and the other 80 are going to be good. Good luck. Who would allow it?
Well, there's another side of this solution, and that is ongoing education. Computer literacy education, K through 12, has to be stepped up. You point that out in your book.
Exactly. But that I'm not hopeful for at all right now, because we're living in a world where everything is so politicized that just the idea of news literacy, it's sort of like the idea of
Kids wearing masks.
kids. Well, no, it's the idea of,
No, I mean, that's how some people see it. You're trying to impose something on it. Yeah.
yeah, you're trying to, just don't put those library, books in my kid's library. But you're going to try, in the polarized world we live in, the suspicion about news literacy education, we already see it because we have some news literacy programs, and they're already starting to get all kinds of opposition from the right, because our idea of news literacy is that if you see a website that to this day says that the election of 2020 was stolen, or Joe Biden, who allegedly got more votes than Donald Trump in 2020, news literacy would teach someone to be skeptical of it. Because again, it's a fact. Just the same as if you saw a website that says, 6 times 7 is arguably 41.
But as you said, generative AI is going to make things even more complicated and more difficult.
Right. I think there are things you can do to regulate generative AI, and I think the generative AI companies have less of a financial stake than the social media platforms did in putting out, ridiculously inaccurate content. What I mean by that is that that's a feature for the social media platforms for all the reasons I explained. Inflammatory content gets more eyeballs, gets more advertising. The generative AI companies are selling a product which they're going to attempt to promise is reliable. It's not an advertising model, it's a consumer model. So I think they will get their act together. The left unspoken is what happens to all the open source generative AI that's out there. So where someone, in a basement somewhere can produce a generative AI product that does all the bad things I've just described.
Well, we've learned a lot from you just in the hour we've had the pleasure of spending with you. And I learned a lot from your writing. And I want to also thank all who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. And if you aren't yet a member of the podcast, I invite you to join by going to our website, graymatter.show, where you can find any previous episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to email any reactions, thoughts, or recommendations you may have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. Thanks to the Great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Cullen, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to this week's guest. His newest book is The Death of Truth, Steven Brill.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.